Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties across the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Washing over the coasts like vast waves, migrating people have left their mark on the North American continent since time immemorial. Following animal migrations eastward, the first known settlers came by land across the Bering Straits from Asia. Thousands of years later, navigators sailed across storm-tossed, trackless seas. Each culture has brought its own words, religion, wisdom, and music to this land of endless richness and unlimited human potential. European immigrants seeking new lives fled persecution, oppression, and poverty in distant lands. Slowly they established colonies, cleared rocky fields, and built small villages with uncertain futures. Many of them on the North Atlantic coast of what would become the United States. The place was Massachusetts, and one of those villages grew up to be the city of Boston. In 1773, when the impassioned protest, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," did not sway the English Parliament to remove the hated Stamp Act, Boston patriots staged the Boston Tea Party. In this heartfelt protest, colonists tossed bales of tea into Boston Harbor rather than pay the tax. 2 years later, on April 18, 1775, Sexton Robert Newman climbed to the steeple of Old North Church and hung 2 lanterns in the belfry arch. 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. With those words, New England poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow etched the story of Paul Revere's ride in the mind of every American schoolchild. Paul Revere and William Dawes galloped headlong from Boston to warn the Minutemen that the British were marching to seize the munitions stockpiled at nearby Concord. The Americans routed the Redcoats with "The Shot Heard Round the World," a shot that foreshadowed the end of English tyranny and European colonialism in the Americas. The American Revolution had begun. Out of that revolution was born a new nation founded on the conviction that the purpose of government is to secure the happiness of the people, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. The historic Freedom Trail reveals the places and buildings where the history of the United States began. The trail starts at Boston Common, established in 1634, and winds past the old Granary Burying Ground, where Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock all rest in peace. Farther along the trail is Paul Revere's house and the Old North Church, where 2 small lanterns lighted the way to freedom. Also along the Freedom Trail is the old State House, once the council chambers of the royal governors. It was the site of many protests, including the 1770 Boston Massacre, in which 5 patriots were killed. Faneuil Hall, often called the Cradle of Liberty, rang with the rhetoric of the revolutionaries and then the abolitionists. 200 years later, Bostonians still hold public debates in the hall whose walls have echoed with words that changed the course of history, walls that witnessed the birth of freedom. The adjacent Faneuil Hall marketplace bustles with busy bistros, boutiques, produce stalls, and colorful flower stands. Across the Charles River in Cambridge is Harvard University, the oldest university in the country, founded in 1636. Tree-filled Harvard Yard is ringed by some of the university's most historic buildings. The oldest of all is Massachusetts Hall, built in 1720. Meandering hand in hand along the Charles River is a traditional lover's stroll, watching the skulls skim across the water as swift as swallows. Off the coast of Massachusetts lies the enchanting Isle of Nantucket. Once the heart of New England's whaling industry, Nantucket is remarkably well preserved, retaining its 19th century charm. Flower-covered cottages line the narrow streets of the tiny village of Sconset. Many writers and artists have made their homes in this quaint, picturesque setting.
Nantucket, for me, is a gestation period. Summer, so filled with the beauty of Nantucket, is when I sketch, think, read, with a minimum of interruption, a minimum of urban crazy time.
Nantucket, a lone ship on a timeless sea. Bright rolling sand dunes that compete with sharp linear cliffs. Roses so abundant and colorful, they seem almost commonplace. The peaceful environment found along the Cape Cod National Seashore remains a great retreat for those lucky enough to discover this beauty. The flaming fall colors of New England's native maples, oaks, and birches entice thousands each year to turn out for this annual wonder of nature. Self-appointed leaf peepers monitor the silent shift from summer's green to the brilliant scarlets and golds of autumn, phoning in daily reports to local newspapers which relay the news as breathlessly as any major sports event. Eclectic, neurotic, exotic, and above all, endlessly exciting. This is the big city, the Big Apple, the distilled essence of the urban and the urbane. Drama or trauma, New York has it all. From Broadway to Greenwich Village, from Fifth Avenue to Times Square, New York City comes in every flavor there is. For more than half a century, New York was the port of entry to the land of opportunity. Ellis Island gave European immigrants new hope, a new home, often a new name, and always a new life. The Statue of Liberty stands now as she has since 1886, lifting her lamp beside the Golden Door. Her shining beacon welcoming your tired, your hungry, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. To support sculptor Frédéric Bartholdi's massive statue, standing 115 feet high and weighing 225 tons, the French engineer Gustave Eiffel designed an elaborate iron and steel skeletal frame similar to the one he would later build for the Eiffel Tower. To celebrate the Great Lady's centennial in 1986, the statue was completely renovated and fireworks emblazoned the sky and lighted the night. Set in a ring of bright waters, New York is a city divided into 5 boroughs: the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and Manhattan. To most of the world, Manhattan is the city. New York, New York. 13.4 miles long and 2.3 miles wide at its widest point, Manhattan encompasses such legendary streets as Broadway, nationally recognized as the pinnacle of legitimate theater, and Wall Street, the beating heart of American finance. Surrounded by tall buildings and busy streets is the urban oasis of Central Park. Once a scrubland, described by the poet William Cullen Bryant as a wasteland, ugly and repulsive. Central Park was transformed into an island of green refuge by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux in 1857. Home to more than 7 million people, New York ranks as one of the world's largest cities. The ethnic diversity of its villages and neighborhoods reflects the cultural mix that makes New York a world unto itself. The state of New York has another wonder as impressive and almost as noisy as the concrete canyons of Manhattan. Niagara Falls is actually not one waterfall, but 3, the tallest of which is the American Falls at 182 feet high. The very name, Niagara, refers to the deafening roar of the plunging waters. It means thunder of water. Named by the Attawandarook tribe, the falls were a place of great spiritual significance to Native Americans. Their legends spoke of a testy and belligerent god who lived behind the vast impenetrable curtain of these headlong, rushing waters. Many of the daredevils who attempted to go over the falls in barrels ended up experiencing the god's anger directly. Quite a few did not live to tell the tale, and such attempts are no longer permitted. The United States was founded on the ideas of liberty and equality. These ideas came to their finest flower in Philadelphia, where both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were drafted. Thomas Jefferson's powerful words in the Declaration of Independence still inspire the heart and stir the mind. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Philadelphia was the new nation's first capital during the Revolutionary War. William Penn Jr., a Quaker, founded the city of brotherly love on the basis of religious freedom and tolerance. The first settlers were Quakers, seeking to live in quiet accordance with their beliefs. To govern the colony, proprietor William Penn Jr. drew up the Charter of Privileges, which opened with these words from the Bible: "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof." In 1752, these words were engraved on the Liberty Bell. America's most historic square mile is Independence National Historic Park. Independence Hall, a handsome example of Georgian architecture, stood witness to the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the drafting of the Constitution. Defying King George III, whom the poet Shelley called an old, blind, mad, despised king, the First Continental Congress met at Carpenter's Hall. The representatives of the First United States Congress took their seats at Congress Hall. Like those who settled Philadelphia, the Amish came to Pennsylvania in the 18th century, fleeing religious persecution. Clinging steadfastly to their belief in plain dress and simple living, many Amish do without cars, telephones, or electricity. Farming with horses in the rich bottomland of Lancaster County, they have prospered quietly and steadily. There is a popular misconception of the Pennsylvania Dutch, embodied in their name. They are not Dutch at all. Dutch is simply a mispronunciation of Deutsch, which means German. True to their principles of peaceful cooperation, they actively work with their neighbors on community activities.
93 by 106. It's a Lone Star. There it is. Look how pretty they are. Wow.
Auctions include everything from Amish quilts and used buggies to tractors. The past lives side by side with the present in peace and prosperity. No war has ever torn this nation apart philosophically the way the war between the states did. No battle before or since has cost as many American lives as the one at Gettysburg in July 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg proved to be a watershed for the Union, turning the tide of the Civil War in its favor. Confederate soldiers fought gallantly and well. The desperate courage and stunning heroism of General Pickett's charge is legendary. 12,000 soldiers dressed in Confederate gray charged Cemetery Ridge across an open wheat field in broad daylight. deadly Union fire gave the words slaughter and carnage a devastating new dimension. Four months later, a bowed and haggard President Lincoln gave a speech dedicating the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The South incorporates a stunningly rich diversity of American cultures: Appalachian, Old South, New South, African, Cuban, and Cajun. Power and beauty have always held a natural attraction, but seldom are they combined in a single space. As the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C. emanates the aura of power. When the cherry trees make their spring metamorphosis into pale ethereal clouds of pink and white blossoms, the city is exquisitely transformed by their fragile loveliness, the perfect fusion of beauty and power. It is difficult to believe that this magnificence grew out of what George Washington described as a mosquito-infested swamp. President Washington appointed French engineer Pierre L'Enfant to lay out the new capital along the Potomac River in 1791. His grand idea for a promenade, the Mall, would later connect the capital to the Lincoln Memorial with 2 miles of open green space and elegant reflecting pools. The polished black granite walls of the powerful and immensely moving Vietnam Veterans Memorial reflect the sun, the grass, and the faces of those who come to see and touch the names carved in shining stone. Designed by a young woman, 21-year-old Maya Ying Lin, the memorial preserves the names of all those dead or missing in the Vietnam War. As part of the design criteria, the monument could make no political statement on the Vietnam War, but the 492-foot wall bearing the names of the 58,000 lost makes its own silent statement about the cost of war in human lives. Also on the Mall is a gift from an Englishman who had never been to the United States. He left his entire fortune, $500,000, to found an institution in Washington to increase and diffuse knowledge. His name was James Smithson, and his legacy is the Smithsonian Institution. The flamboyant castle was the first of the museums. At last count, the Smithsonian administers 14 museums with a staff of 4,000 and houses 75 million items in its collection. So packed is America's attic that only 1% of the collection at the Museum of Natural History is on display. One of the most popular collections is the National Air and Space Museum, which has everything from the Wright brothers' plane to the Apollo 11 command module. L'Enfant's original design called for a large president's palace. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson remarked that the proposed residence was large enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama. The plans were scaled down considerably by President Washington, who removed the entire 3rd story. But when Jefferson became president, he immediately set about enlarging it by adding the east and west wings. Built of white sandstone, what Washington had called the President's House was soon nicknamed the White House. It symbolizes the executive branch of government. Capitol Hill, site of the House of Representatives and the Senate, has become symbolic of the legislative branch and the Supreme Court of the judicial branch. Considering that Washington, D.C. is the ultimate seat of power in the United States, what lingers longest is the impression of Washington's monumental beauty. Many of the homes in the Smoky Mountains were left in ruins by the Civil War. Patiently rebuilt again over the years, they retain much of their original down-home charm.
In the Great Smoky Mountains that touches the sky, where a man is born free.
The Appalachian culture, its handcrafts, music, and song, remain as vibrant as they were more than a century ago. Country music grew up in poverty, just like many of its singers and songwriters. The sound came to Nashville, Tennessee during the Great Depression, when country folk who had little suddenly discovered it was possible to have less. They flocked to Nashville and brought with them their music. Centuries-old Irish and British folk songs met up with the rhythms of Tin Pan Alley, the fervor of gospel, and the aching melodic line of the songs of former slaves. Then singers added dreams of fame and riches. Out of the potent mix of poverty, hope, and music came Hank Williams, Roy Acuff, Dolly Parton, and Loretta Lynn. In 1954, Elvis Presley was turned away from the Grand Ole Opry with the advice that he stick to driving a truck. The same year, promoter Sam Phillips heard him sing. Rock and roll met the mainstream, and a skinny, dark-haired kid with swivel hips made the introduction. Parent-child relationships have never been quite the same. Elvis was 22 years old when he bought Graceland to go with his gold-laden Cadillac covered with 40 coats of paint and crushed diamonds. Graceland stands on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Memphis, Tennessee. Elvis died and was buried here, the final resting place of an American music legend remembered as the King. Located on a thumb of land where the Cooper and Ashley rivers flow into the sea, Charleston heard the first shot fired in the Civil War. Its gracious architecture and magnificent gardens retain the flavor and charm of the Old South. A carriage ride through the historic district displays the city's ample charms, particularly the Calhoun Mansion, a 30-room Victorian manor house built in 1876, the Edmonston Alston House, and the Nathaniel Russell House. "15 miles north of Charleston, Middleton Place is the oldest landscaped garden in the country. A National Historic Landmark, the daily life of this 18th century self-sufficient low country plantation is recreated down to the last authentic detail. Lush gardens laid out by Henry Middleton in 1741 feature the oldest camellias in the New World. Dense with tall cypress, elegantly draped with graceful gray mosses, the luxuriant vegetation of Okefenokee Swamp is reflected in the still waters. This spiritually powerful, eternally mysterious marshland covers an area of 660 square miles, stretching across southern Georgia into Florida. The Creek tribe gave it the name Okefenokee, land of the trembling earth. Miami is an anomaly among American cities. The southernmost major city in the United States, nobody thinks of it as being southern. Much of Miami's exotic appeal comes from its Latin heritage. Juan Ponce de Leon found Florida in 1513. Miami's present Latin flavor is derived mainly from Cuban, Central, and South American influences. Little Havana is a world of its own. Calle Ocho is the main street, lined with cafes filled with Cuban men concentrating intensely on dominoes and cards. Many of the residents are the well-educated professionals who fled Cuba's communist regime in the late 1950s. Others came much earlier, bringing such skills as the precision cutting and rolling of superb hand-rolled cigars, using the same techniques that have made Havana cigars world famous. Many have come to Miami's subtropical splendors not fleeing political repression, but seeking refuge from winter. Coconut Grove, famed as an exclusive neighborhood, is where international harvester magnate James Deering decided to escape Midwestern winters. 1,000 workers labored 2 years to build him a 16th century style Venetian palazzo called Vizcaya, a palatial estate surrounded by 10 acres of formal gardens. Vizcaya houses an eclectic collection of European art and antiques. For most people, Miami Beach is the soul and spirit of Miami. Best of all is South Beach, a mile-square district of colorful 1930s Art Deco hotels and restaurants. Chic cafes line the sidewalks, sleek facades pose for photographers, and snowbirds, northerners fleeing winter's chill, share the beaches with relaxed retirees. The road to relaxation popularly known as Route A1A, leapfrogs from island to island along the southern tip of Florida. Stretching tenuously out across the turquoise sea, the Florida Keys are a string of tiny islands that end in Key West, the southernmost point of the continental U.S. 90 miles from Havana, Cuba, Key West is adrift in a vast expanse of blue sea and sky. Mellow may be too hectic a term to describe the lifestyle of the resident conchs, a nickname for Key Westerners derived from the conch shells found offshore. The 30,000 islanders pass the time by taking careful inventory at the numerous drinking establishments, thrilling at the chance to land the big one, and watching the famous sunsets best viewed from Mallory Square amidst the artists and musicians. Famed novelist Ernest Papa Hemingway lived in Key West, fished the azure waters, and used these enchanting islands as the setting for his novel, To Have and Have Not. Called a river of grass by the Seminoles, who knew intimately the twistings and turnings of this extraordinary wetlands, Everglades National Park stands unique in all of North America. The Everglades is actually a slow-moving freshwater river 100 miles long, 50 miles wide, and no more than a few inches deep. Wherever the soil rises even 3 inches above the water, pine and hardwood trees take root. Romantically labeled mermaids by the inebriated imaginations of early sailors, manatees swim in long, winding channels that meander out into the Gulf of Mexico. While many animal species of the Everglades are in danger of extinction, unfortunately, the bloodthirsty mosquitoes, of which there are dozens of species, are not. The Everglades is unlike any other ecosystem on the continent. Cajun, Creole, crawdads, and carnival. They all say New Orleans. The city was settled by the French in 1718, and the picturesque French Quarter embodies the original charm of New Orleans. The French Quarter's Creole architecture combines both French and Spanish styles and is noted for its iron lace balconies, pastel wooden shutters, and shady cobbled courtyards. Bordering Jackson Square, the heart of the French Quarter, and adjacent to the Cathedral of St. Louis, are the Cabildo and the Presbytère. They stand as charming examples of wide Spanish arches blending smoothly with French mansard roofs. The Mardi Gras Parade is only one of about 50 parades that take place during New Orleans carnival season, but it is certainly the most spectacular. Private clubs called crews hold grand balls, sponsor elaborate floats, and choose kings and queens to toss souvenirs to the crowd from the floats. Maskers in spectacular costumes join the parade in the country's biggest outdoor masquerade. The word Cajun is a corruption of Acadian, the name for the French Canadians exiled from Acadia after the Treaty of Utrecht granted their colony in Nova Scotia to the British in 1713. They settled in the mysterious and isolated Louisiana bayous. Over the centuries, the Cajuns created a distinct culture with its own language, music, and cuisine. Zydeco bands stomp and fiddle infectiously at clan gatherings. Cajun cooking is inextricably bound to the fresh, natural bounty of the bayous. Blackened redfish, jambalaya, and piles of steamed crawdads. Cajuns don't eat, they feast.
Down in this part, people generally get up in the morning. They're happy to be alive. They live life basically a minute at a time, I guess you could say, and they don't worry about tomorrow till it gets there. So I guess you could say down here we have an old saying, "La vie c'est bon ici." Life is good here. It's just a down-home life. If there's anything that can be said for the Cajun way of life, it's be simple. Don't complicate your life.
Plantations along the Mississippi River north of New Orleans contributed substantially to the city's wealth. Slaves were brought from the Caribbean. Cotton, indigo, and sugar were shipped out to Europe. When business was not being conducted, social life was. The Mississippi River divides the United States geographically and culturally. Snaking 2,552 miles north to south, it is North America's largest and longest river. Accepting the waters of 100 tributaries and the soils of 31 states, it separates the east from the west, the forests from the prairies. Changing course constantly, the broad brown waters weave and curl extravagantly from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico in their leisurely meander to the sea. Mark Twain called it the crookedest river in the world after a 4-year stint as a Mississippi riverboat pilot. From the experience, he took his nom de plume, Mark Twain, which signifies water 2 fathoms deep. Goods flowed both ways up and down the Mississippi between New Orleans and Chicago during the 19th century. With the advent of the railroads, Chicago flourished as the major manufacturing center of the Midwest. Raw materials flowed in and finished products poured out across the country. People to make these products surged into Chicago from the South, bringing their music with them. That was the birth of the blues, specifically the legendary Chicago blues. It is said that one must live the blues before one can sing the blues, and nowhere else is this sentiment expressed better than in Chicago.
Lord, that's what I thought that I heard. I thought I heard my baby say, Junior, listen.
A city rising from the shores of the vast inland seas of the Great Lakes, The Windy City, Chicago, is known for its whirlwinds of political passion, dynamic weather, and stunning innovation. The roaring inferno that was the Great Fire of 1871 nearly leveled the city. Within 2 decades, a new urban architecture was born. Chicago architects invented the skyscraper, and a new skyline rose like a phoenix from the ashes. The 110-story Sears Tower is the tallest building in the world, so tall that from the observation deck it is possible to see the curvature of the Earth. At the opposite end of the architectural scale, Frank Lloyd Wright pioneered the low, single-story, prairie-style houses that became the prototype for most of the homes built in 20th century America. Wright's home and adjacent studio in Oak Park are a superb example of his work.
4, 5, 10, 20. Do anything you want. Have a good one. I appreciate it.
Some things are simply unique to Chicago.
What makes Chicago special is Chicago-style hot dogs. The average person here is a connoisseur and an expert. It's not taken lightly. If you would ask the average person a question about a hot dog, they'll talk for 20 minutes.
What do you think? It's a long way. Come on.
A century ago, 90% of Chicago's population were immigrants or first-generation Americans. It's still entirely possible to wander through an ethnic neighborhood and come away thinking you've been in a foreign country. Crossing the Mississippi with all their worldly goods, pioneers heading west in the mid-1800s considered St. Louis the last bastion of civilization. To honor its role as the gateway to the West, St. Louis erected one of America's most recognizable landmarks in 1965, the Gateway Arch. During the westward movement of the 19th century, the largest flood of human migration in the history of the United States occurred. Thousands flooded out of the east, seeking free farmlands and new fortunes. They bought their provisions, posted their last letters, and followed the wagon ruts out of Missouri to the Oregon and Santa Fe trails. In the 25 years after the Civil War, the settled areas of the country doubled in size. Chimney Rock, Nebraska, stands sentinel as it did then, visible for days before it was finally reached, visible for days after it had been passed. The wagons were loaded so heavily, only the sick or very young could ride. Everyone else walked across the continent, step by weary step. The West encompasses extraordinary wonders and spectacular landscapes. Sweeping prairies, towering mountains, bizarre badlands, and vast sand deserts, colors and shapes that bedazzle and bewitch. Locked in its mountain fastness, Yellowstone National Park is so strange, so wondrous, that the Salish and various other local tribes believed it to be under an enchanted spell. When mountain man John Coulter first told people about Yellowstone in 1807, they thought he must be mad. Scalding water, shooting hundreds of feet into the air, pools of purple, red, and yellow boiling and bubbling, icy water plunging hundreds of feet into the river. Yet Coulter was vindicated because all those natural marvels are part of Yellowstone. The first national park established in the world, Yellowstone is one of the most extraordinary places on the planet. It is an enchanted land, and the animals are no less magical than the scenic wonders of Yellowstone. Bigger than all outdoors, better than any other place could possibly be. That's the Texans' view of Texas. Even American football takes no backseat in Texas.
We gonna win. I said we gonna win. I tell you we gonna win. No, we gonna win.
Rich with rustic adobe buildings and old Spanish missions set on the banks of a graceful, curving river, San Antonio was built on the site of a tiny native village in 1718. The village had welcomed its first European guest nearly 120 years before, when the roving Franciscan friar, Padre Massanet, followed the river and stumbled upon the village on the feast day of St. Anthony, and so named the village San Antonio. Shaded by luxuriant cypress, oak, and willow trees, cobbled paths wind their way along the San Antonio River for more than 2 miles of the Paseo del Rio, or River Walk. At the heart of San Antonio is the Mission San Antonio de Valero, best known as the Alamo. Overrun by General Santa Anna's huge Mexican army, both backwoodsman Davy Crockett and mountain man Jim Bowie were among the 189 men who died defending the Alamo in 1836. Austin, El Paso, Houston, Dallas, all are cities that are at the center of countless stories of the Old West. The flat Texas landscape is perforated with modern skyscrapers rising to compete for the sunlight. Cattle and oil have made the fortunes of many Texans. Thousands of head of cattle raised on sprawling ranches are rounded up every year by cowboys and driven hundreds of miles north. Roundups, complete with Stetson-hatted cowboys and chuck wagons, are still very much a part of Texas. And what would a roundup be without the signature cowboy boot? At the Tony Lama factory, craftsmen ply their skills creating works of art in bullhide, ostrich, and snakeskin. Truly a luxury item ranging from $250 to $1,900 a pair. "60% of all the oil and gas wells drilled in the United States are drilled within a 500-mile radius of Houston. Cattle and oil together fueled the massive human migrations that swept over Texas in the 19th and 20th centuries. In this stark, inhospitable land of the Southwest, the Anasazi, whose name means the Ancient Ones, built elaborate dwellings. Some were built into almost inaccessible cliffs. They remain engineering marvels of this age-old agrarian civilization that migrated from the surrounding flatlands some 700 years ago. Archaeologists believe that warfare and possibly the lack of water forced the Anasazi to seek safety and mountain springs high on the cliffs. In the land of the Ancient Ones, only the silent, wind-swept ruins remain. Called the Dancing Ground of the Sun by the Pueblo tribes, the site where Santa Fe now stands is a 7,000-foot-high plateau surrounded by sagebrush-swept desert and the forested peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Efforts to preserve the area's native culture and adobe architecture have resulted in much research on the Pueblo tribes and restoration of Pueblo ruins. Santa Fe is an active artists and writers colony. Novelist D.H. Lawrence wrote that the moment I saw the brilliant, proud morning shine high up over the deserts of Santa Fe, something stood still in my soul, and the old world gave way to a new. The Grand Canyon, carved by the Colorado River, that fact seems an impossibility when the slim ribbon of water is seen from the rim of the canyon. It is a just measure of the scope of this great wonder that the mighty Colorado is dwarfed by the very canyon it created. The history of the land for millions of years is written in the sediments, chiseled in stone by time and the incalculable forces of nature. An island of neon in the middle of a desert, Las Vegas comes alive after dark with an explosion of lights.
I am the star. You better.
Glitzy, glamorous, tacky, or merely amazing. Whichever the description, it's accurate. Surely Las Vegas has more neon per square mile than any other place on Earth.
The principle of glass blowing is the same that it's always been. It's heating the glass evenly all the way around and then just letting it cool by itself. Anything that you draw in the form of a letter or a picture, we can make.
Las Vegas, the art of taking excess to extremes. Called Death Valley for its searing sands and soaring temperatures, it is in fact filled with life. Busy, scurrying creatures often sleep by day and hunt in the cool of night. Spring wildflowers burst into bloom, dotting the desert sands with brilliant color. Called the Golden West, the Pacific region stretches from California to Alaska to the Hawaiian Islands. A land of opposites, sandy, sun-soaked southern beaches give way to misty, mysterious northern rainforests. The roar of fire and ice fills the air from active volcanoes to ancient glaciers. Often described as suburbs in search of a city, Los Angeles sprawls across 1,000 square miles of low desert. America's love affair with the automobile reaches its peak in LA. And if only for a moment, grown men become boys in a sea of roaring classics. People don't walk in LA, they drive. And of course, the freeway traffic is legendary. Burbank's Media City is home to some of the most famous movie studios. Walt Disney Studio, locally known as the Mickey Mouse House, Warner Brothers, and the NBC television studios are all here. Many of Hollywood's most memorable moments were born in Burbank.
Get going. No objections. No objections.
No objections.
From the early comedies to the blockbuster epics, Hollywood continues to entertain its audiences. What's one word for fun on the beach? The answer has to be Venice. Rollerblading, playing volleyball, sauntering or sunning, Venice has everything a beach could possibly offer. Called the world's most dramatic geological spectacle, Yosemite National Park turns every superlative into an understatement. Yosemite Valley is walled by sheer granite cliffs 1 mile high, from which waterfalls cascade. The highest waterfall on the North American continent, Yosemite Falls, plunges 2,425 feet in 2 levels. The upper fall is 1,500 feet high, by itself 9 times the height of Niagara. Glaciers left behind El Capitan, the largest known single block of granite in the world, and the massive Half Dome, so sheer it appears to have been cut with a knife. Spanning the opening to the bay, the mile-long Golden Gate Bridge is San Francisco's best-known landmark. Built in 1935 during America's Great Depression, it is easily one of the most beautiful bridges in the world.
A lot of times we're up high on the tower. Once in a while we have to go up in the tower and do this and that. We were up in the sunshine and we couldn't even see the deck from there, so high. But it was nice sometimes, but most of the time it was miserable. But it was honest and the money was there and we were crazy to do it, so we loved it.
During the gold rush, Chinese men imported to build the Transcontinental Railroad flooded into San Francisco. Chinatown became and remains the largest Chinese community outside of mainland China. An enclave of pagoda-roofed buildings and open-air produce bins, the shop windows display all the treasures of the Orient. Nearby is North Beach with its colorful Italian neighborhoods. The Castro District, center of San Francisco's gay community, and the Mission District, where Latino cultures maintain their heritage. Wrested out of 1,000 acres of windswept sand dunes, Golden Gate Park was the vision and lifelong passion of John McLaren, a crusty Scot who was the park's first director. A Victorian conservatory, a superb arboretum, an exquisite Japanese garden, and 3 fine museums are nestled among the trees and lawns McLaren planted. Home to more than 150 wineries, California's Napa and Sonoma valleys are dotted with vineyards and delightful country inns. The grapes produce dozens of premier wines, including Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Sauvignon Blanc. Each of the wineries offers wine tasting, insight into the history of winemaking, and often fascinating glimpses into the process itself, from the vines to the grapes, to the crushing, to the casks. On the northwest coast of the continental U.S., the Olympic Peninsula projects across Puget Sound. One of the few temperate rainforests, the peninsula has giant trees whose trunks and branches are thick with moss. Ferns, mushrooms, mosses, and over 300 species of plants fill the forest with a sense of rich luxuriance. Here, the North Coast tribes lived in great prosperity, building comfortable longhouses of cedar and feasting on salmon and shellfish. They still come to these shores to sing ancient songs and perform traditional dances. Edged by the deep blue waters of Puget Sound, dominated by snow-capped Mount Rainier, Seattle has one of the most felicitous locations of any city in the United States. True, it rains from October to April. Undenied rumors circulate that residents don't tan, they rust. But all that rain keeps Seattle's many parks and green belts a rich, luxurious green all year round. Seattle's Space Needle provides a 360-degree view of Puget Sound and surrounding mountains. Overlooking the Sound is Pike Place Market, a farmer's market founded in 1907. Some of the stalls have been handed down for 3 generations.
Nice king salmon. King salmon are the juiciest. This will probably feed about 5 people. What do you think? Huh? Nice one? Inbound!
A cornucopia of all the richest bounty of the West Coast, Pike Place Market offers fresh-caught king salmon, Dungeness crab, oysters, asparagus, wild mushrooms like morels, chanterelles, and porcini, as well as blueberries, strawberries, peaches, and apricots. It's enough to make a serious cook delirious. Any of several charming islands in the Sound are reached by ferries that run rain or shine. They sail to Elliott Bay, to Bainbridge Island, up the Sound to Whidbey Island, and over to Tillicum Village on Blake Island. On the island, native artists carve the stylized animals that are the totems for each clan, creating what is literally a family tree. The largest state, the northernmost state, Alaska, is the kind of place superlatives were made for. Called Denali, the Great One, by the Athapascans, Alaska's Mount McKinley towers more than 20,000 feet, the highest peak on the North American continent. Denali National Park comprises a stupendous 6 million acres of mountains and tundra, set aside to preserve native wildlife. Spring comes in late June, when carpets of wildflowers cover the ground and the Arctic sun shines 20 hours a day. Along the Katmai Peninsula, some of the world's most incredible fishing takes place. A sinuous cast, the graceful curve of the line, the fragile fly dancing delicately on sparkling water, the rush of the strike, and at last, the prize. A long chain of islands stretches 1,600 miles across the blue waters of the Pacific. The Hawaiian Islands were formed by a series of volcanic eruptions. The larger inhabited islands are all clustered at the southeastern end of the chain, 2,500 miles from the U.S. mainland. Beneath the transparently clear waters of Pearl Harbor lies the USS Arizona. Sunk in the 1941 surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese bombers, she remains a visible example of what the official inquiry termed the greatest military and naval disaster in our nation's history. The largest dormant volcano in the world, Haleakala was called by native Hawaiians the House of the Sun. From the top of Haleakala, the god Maui lassoed the sun to force it to make its way across the sky more slowly. The valley encompasses 19 square miles and is 3,000 feet deep. But the true experience of Haleakala is the moment of sunrise, when the first light turns the sea silver and the sky a flaming red. Dawn washes light over the islands of Oahu, Lanai, Molokai, and Hawaii, and the rising sun burnishes the sea until it glows like molten gold. A nation born of the burning desire for freedom. A vast land of extraordinary richness. Forests that blaze with natural color. Prairies that stretch to endless horizons. Mountains that soar into the sky. Cities that gleam against the night. A country dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. A nation that grew up to be the land of the free.